So we're talking about cybersecurity leadership principles. You recall the first one we talked about was communication and the value of communication. Second one was the value of looking for opportunities, whether it's opportunities for cybersecurity businesses or opportunities for improving our response to cybersecurity within our own business. These are things that leaders want to think about. Third one, we'll say law. If you fight the law will win, is a cybersecurity principle that leaders need to, I think, bear in mind. Now, depending on the business, as we alluded to before, certain businesses have to notify the authorities when a breach occurs. It is the law. Healthcare. If a breach happens in a healthcare industry, then the authorities need to be notified, and the clients need to be notified if their data was placed at risk or breached. Other businesses, and depending on which state we're in, may have different types of rules and regulations, but the simple point here is that leaders need to be familiar with this law, and they need the people who are overseeing cybersecurity within a particular company or business to also be familiar. In addition, failure to protect data may make companies liable for lawsuits. They may lose money. They may lose, in addition to the liability, the civil liability, they may lose the trust of the customers, and they may, if they have insurance, those insurance premiums are going to go up inevitably if it's shown that they were at fault. Think of a time when someone causes an accident, an automobile accident, and how the rates go up whenever we use our insurance. It's the same thing with cybersecurity insurance. If a company is found to be liable, and although that insurance may be covered, their rates will go up for the violation of the regulations. Also, failing to protect the civil liberties of consumers may place companies at risk. Every so often you'll hear of someone that's overseeing a particular larger social media platform getting called to Congress to talk about how are you protecting the civil liberties of the people using your platform. And they provide certain examples of what they do to try and protect the consumers, whatever that may be. That failure to protect places these companies at risk for being cited for violations. Now, there's a couple of different types of laws that leaders would be familiar with, or those in cybersecurity within a particular business or company should be familiar with. There is, at the broadest level, the criminal law. The criminal law refers to those laws that a state or federal government have said, if you engage in these particular behaviors, these are offenses against the state or the federal government. And as offenses against the state or federal government, there are prescribed criminal penalties that could be applied to you for violating these laws. Leaders need to be familiar with the criminal law and what the prescribed penalties are in the event that their workers break the law, or if the organization or the business breaks the law. And leaders need to be familiar with these aspects so they're prepared to how to best respond to those situations where it's been alleged that the company has actually risen to the level of breaking the criminal law. Now, the criminal law in theory is the most serious type of law in terms of the types of behavior it governs and the types of penalties that are prescribed. The criminal law allows people to be sent to prison for the violations. Now, companies and businesses can't be sent to prison, but they could be given pretty serious fines for failing to protect data, or if the workers themselves could be sent to prison if it's demonstrated that their behavior is criminal. Now, criminal means that the act was an intentional violation and against the prescribed state or federal laws without defense or justification and sanctioned by the state as a felony or a misdemeanor. That's a paraphrase version of a definition that Frank Tappin's provided. But for leaders, it's important they recognize that if their workers break the criminal law, they have to make decisions about how they're going to proceed. Are they going to report it to the authorities? And in some cases, they don't have a choice, and they have to report it to the authorities. And if they don't report it, the authorities will eventually likely find out. And then the leader has broken the law by not reporting that a violation has occurred. They've actually broken a criminal law and a civil law and a regulatory law. And they could be held criminally liable, depending upon the state they're in. But I mentioned civil law. Civil law is a different branch of law than criminal law. And these laws refer to instances where it's determined that an individual harmed another individual. So the offense isn't against the state, but the offense is against the individual. Now, obviously, many crimes are committed against individuals, but the way the laws are written is the criminal justice system gets involved when the crime is defined by the state or federal government as a crime against the state or federal government. Whereas a civil offense, these are laws that say if you do these things against other individuals, those individuals could actually sue you for engaging in these behaviors. So if a company fails to protect the data of its consumers, its clients, its customers, they could potentially be civilly liable. And these civil violations could result in lawsuits either by the state or federal government or even by the individuals who experience those civil wrongs. Leaders would need to recognize the amount of protection they have in a particular company. Now, depending on whether we're working it could be that someone's working for a state or federal government and they're sued, and in those cases they may have lawyers that will help cover them. But in a particular business, a leader who doesn't own that business, they would want to know if they're going to be covered through lawsuits, if the company is found civilly liable. Is the company going to provide an attorney, or the business going to provide an attorney for that individual, or do they have to provide their own? These are questions that come up in any of these types of cases, but it's something that leaders want to be familiar with. There's also regulatory law. Regulatory law is a branch of law that would refer to regulations that businesses are expected to follow, and that there may be different types of regulatory agencies that oversee those aspects of a business. Healthcare has certain agencies, federal and state agencies, they have to report to, and they are evaluated by. And if they're found to be breaking certain rules, then they've violated regulatory laws. Now, in addition to those sorts of regulations in healthcare, many businesses are licensed and have certain federal or state government agencies that they're responsible to abide by the regulations of those state and federal agencies. And a simpler example might be if you think about how when you go to a restaurant, the restaurant has to abide by state regulations and federal regulations for the types of food it serves. But in a similar way, there are many regulations in terms of the way that we roll out and use our cyber technologies in businesses that we're expected to follow for state and federal regulations. And if we break any of those specific regulations, that would be an example where we could be held accountable. And leaders would want to be familiar with those regulations, depending on which business they are in, what they're creating, what they're doing. And they need to recognize, again, if they try and respond to the law, and we're sort of oversimplifying it with if you fight the law will win. What we're saying is if you break the law, if your company breaks the law, there are serious ramifications. And that fourth area of law is administrative law. Now, administrative law some would combine with regulatory law, but others would see it as a different branch of law. And the administrative law would, again, like regulatory law, have to do with specific rules and procedures that individuals are expected to follow and individuals are expected to abide by. But these could be set not necessarily by federal government or state government, but by accrediting agencies, for example, or companies that or agencies that license particular types of businesses. So the licensing businesses may not necessarily be federal or state government agencies, but they might be accrediting agencies that accredit educational organizations or health organizations or whatever business we're developing. And the violation of certain accreditation rules could be seen as administrative violations. Now, we're not necessarily going to call them law violations, but the consequence of violating these administrative regulations could be just as serious and consequential as violating other types of law. If we have a business that our business requires a certain type of accreditation in order to function, and we break the accreditation rules, and the accrediting body comes in and examines the behavior, and then comes down on the business and says, we're taking away your accreditation. In effect, we're losing our business license, and we may not be able to operate. Lawyers have, as members of state bars, they have to follow certain rules. If they break those rules, they could be sanctioned and lose their licenses. Now, these rule violations within that context, again, not violations of the law per se, but violations of the rules that a particular business group or administrative agency has designed. Now, I've given examples of state bars and healthcare accreditation and education accreditation. There's plenty of other examples in the professional setting where businesses have to abide by certain administrative rules in order to actually be seen as a legitimate business. While there's those professional accrediting bodies, there are also administrative courts that get involved in at state and federal levels that would get involved in, similar to regulatory agencies, in hearing proceedings and determining whether individuals are abiding by the rules that have been set. So for leaders want to recognize that there are all sorts of ways that they can get in trouble in terms of cybersecurity and the use of data and the sharing of data. Leaders want to recognize that while there are these many different ways that they can get into trouble, there are things they can do to prepare against trouble. But the first stage would be to set, as we've noted before, set that example from the top, and we'll talk more about that in another mini module. But another example would be to just be familiar with what the rules are, what the regulations are, how to promote those rules and regulations, and be ready for if someone breaks the rules and regulations in the business, to determine how to best respond to that violation. It's being familiar with the law and understanding the law and knowing who to turn to when those violations occur that put businesses in the type of position and leaders in the position that they want to be in, so they are able to respond. Because with these law violations, if they're serious enough, it's going to hit the public. The public's going to know about it, and they shouldn't be surprised if their legislators and their congressional representatives call them to the state capitol or the federal capitol to have a little chat about what the leaders are doing in terms of protecting companies' information.